A devastating new chapter in the war between Russia and Ukraine has opened tonight, one that fundamentally alters the geographical and psychological contours of a conflict now well into its second year. In a severe and direct response to a massive Russian bombardment of civilian infrastructure in Kyiv, Ukrainian forces have executed an unprecedented retaliatory strike against the Russian capital, Moscow. Initial reports from emergency services and government statements indicate a coordinated attack involving multiple waves of unmanned aerial vehicles and potentially other long-range munitions has struck several districts within the Moscow city region. Significant fires are reported at key infrastructure sites, including a major electrical substation critical to the city's power grid and a large fuel storage depot on the city's outskirts. Social media footage, which cannot be independently verified but has been geolocated by open-source analysts, shows substantial plumes of black smoke rising over areas in the southwest and southeast of the metropolis, with emergency service sirens heard across the city. The scale of the damage suggests a serious disruption to power and logistics in parts of the capital, marking the most significant and damaging attack on the city since the beginning of the invasion. This strike represents a dramatic escalation in Ukraine's demonstrated capability and willingness to project force, moving beyond symbolic attacks on border regions to a concerted assault on the symbolic and functional heart of the Russian state. The Ukrainian operation comes as a direct retaliation for a brutal Russian missile and drone attack on the Ukrainian capital just hours earlier. That assault, part of a renewed Kremlin campaign to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure during the winter, saw dozens of missiles and Shahed drones overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses, striking residential buildings and power facilities across Kyiv. Preliminary casualty figures from Ukrainian officials report multiple deaths and injuries, with widespread power outages affecting heating and water supply for millions in freezing temperatures. The Russian strike followed a now familiar pattern of targeting civilian areas with the apparent aim of breaking Ukrainian morale, a tactic that has consistently failed but has repeatedly drawn international condemnation. Ukraine's response, however, breaks from established patterns. Where previous Ukrainian deep strikes have focused on military, logistical, and economic targets in border regions or occupied Crimea, tonight's action strikes at the core of Russian political power. The message from Kyiv is unambiguous. The strategy of terrorizing Ukrainian cities will no longer go unanswered, and the price for such attacks will be levied directly on Moscow itself. The operational execution of such a strike against one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth points to a significant evolution in Ukrainian military technology and tactical planning. Moscow is protected by a dense, multi-layered air defense network considered among the most advanced globally, including the long-range S-400 Triumph and shorter-range Panzer S-1 systems. Penetrating this shield required either a technological breakthrough, a tactical innovation that identified and exploited a systemic vulnerability, or a combination of both. Military analysts are examining the possibility that Ukraine deployed a new, longer-range variant of its domestically produced drone, one with enhanced stealth characteristics, or electronic countermeasures designed to confuse Russian radar. Another possibility is the use of modified, repurposed jet-powered drones or even clandestinely deployed systems provided by international partners, though no government has acknowledged such transfers. The attack's success in causing tangible damage suggests it was not a mere harassment raid, but a carefully planned operation with specific high-value targets in mind, likely planned over weeks or months with detailed intelligence on Moscow's defensive arrangements. The fact that it followed so closely on the heels of the Kyiv attack also indicates a high state of readiness and a pre-authorized mandate for proportional response, signaling a new and more fluid escalation protocol from the Ukrainian military and security leadership. Historically, this event marks the crossing of a threshold that many analysts believe the Kremlin considered a fundamental red line. Throughout the conflict, despite Ukrainian strikes on fuel depots and minor incidents within Russia, the relative safety of Moscow has been a psychological pillar for the Russian political establishment and a key element of the narrative sold to the Russian public. The war in this telling was a distant special military operation necessary for national security, but not a direct threat to daily life in the capital. Tonight's fires shatter that illusion completely. It echoes, in a modern context, the symbolic power of Allied bombing campaigns against Berlin and Tokyo in World War II, which brought the reality of total war to the seats of fascist power. In the more recent context of the Ukraine war, it is the culmination of an escalating drone campaign that began with strikes on the Kerch Bridge and advanced to attacks on airfields deep inside Russia and energy terminals near St. Petersburg. Each step has incrementally expanded the accepted battlefield, with tonight's strike representing the largest and most consequential leap. It firmly establishes that in an age of proliferating long-range drone technology, geographical sanctuary for political leadership is a diminishing concept, a lesson with profound implications for global security far beyond Eastern Europe. The immediate political implications within Russia are seismic and unpredictable. For President Vladimir Putin, who has built his authority on a promise of restoring Russian strength and guaranteeing national security, an attack of this scale on Moscow constitutes a direct and profound challenge to his legitimacy. The imagery of the capital under fire, regardless of the actual military significance of the damage, is politically toxic. It empowers his critics across the spectrum, from ultra-nationalist mill bloggers who have long demanded total war, to more moderate elements who may question his management of the conflict. The Russian Ministry of Defense and the Federal Security Service, FSB, will face intense, immediate pressure from the Kremlin to explain the catastrophic security failure. This will likely trigger a new round of purges, scapegoating, and internal repression as the regime seeks to reassert control and identify culprits for the intelligence and defensive lapses. The carefully maintained facade of normalcy in Moscow, crucial for the political stability of the system, has been violently pierced. How the state media apparatus manages the narrative, whether it downplays the event, uses it to mobilize patriotic fury, or admits to a significant attack, will be a key indicator of the regime's confidence and its next strategic move. The political compact with the Russian elite, particularly the wealthy Muscovite class who have been largely insulated, is also strained as their personal sense of safety is abruptly undermined, is less than, end of thinking, is greater than, continue part 2. The economic ramifications of a successful strike on Moscow's infrastructure, while localized compared to attacks on energy hubs like Ust-Luga, carry a unique and potent symbolism that will resonate through markets and boardrooms. The direct damage to a major electrical substation and fuel depot will cause disruptive but likely repairable localized outages. The greater impact is psychological and systemic. It demonstrates to domestic and international investors that even the core infrastructure in the nation's capital is vulnerable, injecting a new layer of risk into an economy already buckling under sanctions, capital flight, and the distortions of a war footing. For multinational corporations with remaining operations in Moscow, security assessments will be urgently revisited. The attack also forces the Russian government to divert immense resources toward hardening the defenses of Moscow and other major population centers, pulling further financial and material capital away from the offensive in Ukraine. This diversion effect is a strategic gain for Kyiv, effectively imposing a new and heavy defensive tax on the Russian state. Furthermore, the spectacle of chaos in the capital could trigger volatility in the ruble and on the Moscow exchange, as it shakes the confidence of the very financial operators the Kremlin has worked to reassure. While Russia's central bank has proven adept at managing currency crises, this event represents a shock to market psychology that technocratic interventions may struggle to fully contain, potentially leading to more aggressive capital controls and further economic isolation. Socially, the impact on the Russian populace, particularly the several million residents of Moscow, represents a watershed moment. For 2 years, state television has portrayed the war as a necessary, successful, and distant endeavor. The sound of explosions, the sight of smoke over familiar skylines, and the experience of power fluctuations in their own homes will create a jarring cognitive dissonance for a population accustomed to detachment. This visceral experience cannot be fully explained away by news anchors. While it may initially rally some around the flag in a surge of patriotism and outrage, it also seeds deep-seated anxiety and raises fundamental questions about the war's direction and its personal cost. The social contract in Putin's Russia has long traded political acquiescence for stability and improved living standards. The The attack on Moscow directly assaults the promise of stability. This could accelerate the silent, passive forms of dissent already observed: whispered criticisms, increased cynicism, and a desire among the professional classes to distance themselves and their families from the conflict. The Kremlin's information apparatus will work overtime to frame the attack as evidence of NATO's direct involvement and the existential threat Russia faces, aiming to convert fear into nationalist resolve. However, managing this reaction will be a delicate and unprecedented challenge, as the reality of war physically intrudes upon the country's most privileged and politically important urban center. The international reaction will be one of extreme tension and grave concern. Ukraine's Western allies, while steadfast in their support for Ukraine's right to self-defense, will be placed in a diplomatically complex position. Publicly, they will likely emphasize that Ukraine is responding to brutal attacks on its civilians and that Russia's aggression has inevitably brought consequences to its own soil. Privately, there will be urgent consultations about escalation management and renewed appeals for Kyiv to remain focused on military targets to maintain the moral high ground. For nations in the global south, the strike will be seen as a dramatic confirmation of the war's expanding scope and a sobering demonstration of modern warfare's inability to be contained. It may harden the positions of those calling for an immediate ceasefire while leading others to further distance themselves from a Russia now perceived as both aggressor and vulnerable. The reaction from China will be meticulously calibrated. Beijing will express concern over the escalation and reiterate calls for dialogue, but will be deeply troubled by the demonstration of a non-NATO power successfully striking the heart of a permanent UN Security Council member. This could prompt China to privately urge Moscow to show restraint, fearing a wider regional conflagration that would severely damage its own economic and strategic interests. The overarching global security implication is the normalization of strategic strikes against capital cities in interstate conflict, a precedent that will alarm governments worldwide and likely spur increased investment in domestic drone defense systems. Expert military and geopolitical analysis converges on the assessment that this event represents a point of no return in the conflict's dynamics. Technically, it proves that Ukrainian innovation, combined with available technology, can overcome even sophisticated integrated air defense systems when applied with clever tactics and detailed intelligence. This will spur immediate and frantic Russian efforts to adapt their defenses, potentially by reallocating systems from other fronts, further depleting their coverage in Ukraine. For Ukrainian strategy, it validates a powerful new tool for deterrence, the credible threat to impose direct, painful costs on Russian leadership and its support base in response to attacks on Ukrainian civilians. However, experts universally warn of the extreme danger of the ensuing escalation ladder. The Kremlin, humiliated and pressured, faces a limited menu of possible responses, all of which carry high risks. It could order a massive and indiscriminate bombardment of Ukrainian civilian centers in a disproportionate retaliation, potentially employing a greater proportion of its strategic missile reserves. It could expand attacks on Western-supplied logistics hubs in NATO border countries, dramatically raising the risk of direct alliance involvement. Or, most alarmingly, it could engage in nuclear saber rattling or raise the alert status of its strategic forces to signal the unacceptable costs of further such strikes. The attack also increases the likelihood of aggressive Russian covert action and cyber attacks against Ukrainian and Western government infrastructure in retaliation. What happens next hinges on the Kremlin's risk calculus and its assessment of its own political stability. The immediate priority for Russian authorities will be to restore a sense of order in Moscow, physically repair the damage, and launch a narrative counter-off front. A severe military response against Ukraine is almost certain, but its scale and character will define the next phase. The international community will engage in a frenetic round of diplomacy, attempting to establish channels to communicate red lines and prevent a catastrophic miscalculation. For Ukraine, the period following this strike will be one of maximum vigilance, preparing for the inevitable Russian retaliation while assessing the strategic value of having demonstrated this new capability. The war has now entered a territory with minimal historical precedent, where the capital cities of both belligerents are active targets within a conflict that remains largely conventional elsewhere. This introduces a volatile new variable, the direct security of the ruling regime in Moscow, into an already complex equation, making the conflict more unpredictable and dangerous than at any point since its inception. The long-term consequence is the irreversible erosion of the concept of a secure rear area in modern warfare, a lesson that will echo in defense ministries around the globe for years to come. The economic ramifications of a successful strike on Moscow's infrastructure, while localized in immediate physical damage, create profound systemic risks that extend far beyond the repair costs of a fuel depot or electrical station. The psychological impact on market confidence is the primary vector of economic damage. For the domestic business elite and the remaining international firms operating in Russia, the attack fundamentally recalibrates risk assessments. Moscow was previously viewed as a secure administrative and financial center, insulated from the war's physical dangers. That perception has now been shattered. This will likely accelerate capital flight, encourage the relocation of key personnel and operations abroad, and further strain the Russian banking sector. The government's ability to manage the ruble and control inflation, already challenged by sanctions and military spending, faces a new stress test from this shock to market psychology. Furthermore, the imperative to now defend Moscow and other major urban centers to an unprecedented degree will force a reallocation of scarce resources. Advanced air defense systems like the S-400 and Panzer S-1, along with their trained crews, may be pulled from protecting frontline troops or strategic assets elsewhere to form a defensive ring around the capital. This represents a significant strategic opportunity cost for the Russian war effort in Ukraine, as it dilutes defensive coverage over logistics hubs and command centers in occupied territories, the financial burden of rapidly enhancing metropolitan air defense networks, manufacturing more interceptor missiles, and hardening critical infrastructure nationwide will further strain a state budget already deeply in deficit due to war expenditures and declining energy revenues. Socially, the attack represents a psychological breach of the greatest magnitude since the invasion began. For the residents of Moscow, a city that has largely experienced the war through state media narratives and distant economic effects, the tangible evidence of conflict through sirens, smoke, and potential disruptions to daily life, creates an unavoidable personal connection to the violence. The Kremlin's information apparatus will immediately work to frame this as an act of terrorist desperation by a NATO puppet regime, aiming to channel public shock into renewed nationalist fervor and support for harsher retaliation. This narrative may resonate with a segment of the population. However, for another segment, particularly the urban professional class, whose support is passive and conditional on stability, the event may provoke anxiety, disillusionment, and a deeper questioning of the war's aims and management. The social contract of apolitical compliance in exchange for safety and economic normalcy has been violated. While this is unlikely to trigger mass public protest under current conditions of severe repression, it can foster a pervasive, quiet demoralization and a desire for disengagement. The regime may respond not only with heightened propaganda, but also with increased surveillance and pressure on dissent, further tightening the controls on society. The long-term social consequence could be a deepening divide between a hardened, state-dependent population that accepts the official narrative of a nation under siege and a disillusioned, disengaged middle class that withdraws further from public life or seeks opportunities abroad. Internationally, the escalation forces uncomfortable calculations upon every major global actor. For Ukraine's Western allies, the balancing act becomes more delicate. Public statements will reaffirm Ukraine's right to self-defense and place full responsibility for the escalation on Russia's original attacks on civilians. Privately, diplomats and military officials will convey clear messages to Kyiv about the critical importance of focusing strikes on legitimate military and economic targets to maintain the coalition's unity and public support. There will be intensified, behind closed doors, discussions about escalation management, with NATO members reviewing their own force postures in Eastern Europe as a precaution. For China, the event is deeply unwelcome. It disrupts Beijing's narrative of promoting peace talks while maintaining a no-limits partnership with Russia. China will likely call urgently for restraint and dialogue, but will also assess the demonstrated vulnerabilities in Russian air defenses, which may influence its own strategic planning regarding Taiwan and its perceptions of Russian military effectiveness as a partner. For other major powers like India and Brazil, the strike underscores the futility of hedging and the growing risks of global spillover, potentially increasing pressure on them to take a more active diplomatic role. The broader, chilling lesson for the international community is the definitive erosion of the principle that capital cities are sanctuaries in conventional conflict between nation-states, a norm that had held for decades in Europe. Expert analysis of the military technical aspects highlights a consequential leap in unmanned warfare. Penetrating the Moscow air defense envelope required either advanced stealth characteristics, sophisticated electronic warfare to blind or spoof radars, ultra-low altitude terrain following flight profiles, or a saturation attack that overwhelmed command and control. The most likely scenario involves a combination of these tactics, executed with drones that represent the next generation of Ukrainian indigenous weapons development. This success will trigger a frantic Russian effort to adapt, potentially including the rushed deployment of prototype counter-drone systems, the reinforcement of electronic warfare units around key cities, and possible retaliatory strikes on suspected Ukrainian drone manufacturing sites. However, the defensive challenge is now vastly more complex. Russia must defend an enormous landmass, with critical infrastructure scattered across thousands of kilometers, against an enemy capable of producing relatively low-cost, long-range attack drones in decentralized workshops. This shifts the cost curve dramatically in Ukraine's favor, forcing Russia into an exhausting and expensive defensive posture. The attack also provides invaluable real-world data to NATO on the performance and potential vulnerabilities of Russian air defense systems, data that will be analyzed for years to come. The trajectory of the conflict following this inflection point is fraught with hazard. The most immediate and probable development is a severe and disproportionate Russian retaliation against Ukrainian urban and energy targets, potentially of a scale not yet seen, aimed at restoring a sense of punitive dominance. A second, parallel track will involve intense Russian efforts to disrupt the supply chains, enabling Ukraine's deep strike capability, which could lead to increased missile and drone attacks on logistics nodes in western Ukraine and escalated threats against nations supplying components. The internal political dynamics within Russia will trend toward greater authoritarian consolidation, with Putin likely removing or sidelining officials blamed for the defense failure and centralizing wartime decision-making even further. For Ukraine, the period ahead will be one of preparing for the retaliatory storm while assessing the strategic gains of having altered Russia's strategic calculus and imposed a new, deep internal cost. The conflict has entered a phase where both sides possess the demonstrated ability to strike at the other's symbolic center of gravity. This mutual vulnerability creates a precarious, unstable deterrence that could either lead to a frozen conflict born of exhaustion and fear of further escalation, or to a sudden, catastrophic spike in violence as one side attempts a decisive knockout blow. The role of international diplomacy in the coming weeks will be critical, not to broker a peace which remains distant, but to establish clear, back-channel communication to manage the escalation and prevent the worst-case scenarios of direct NATO-Russian confrontation or the use of weapons of mass destruction. The war is now, undeniably, on a new and more dangerous plane, with its ultimate ramifications stretching far beyond the borders of Ukraine.